Okay, thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm Alison Edgerton, as Julie said. So today, this afternoon, we're looking at it's a brief introduction to autism, and specifically with that early years focus. So with that, we're going to ask you guys what you know already about autism. We're going to look at some other names that you might have heard for autism. We're going to look at autism as a spectrum, the triad of differences, and then we'll look at the areas of that triad in a little more depth. So social interaction, communication, flexibility, sensory, and then finally we'll look at some key pedagogical approaches. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is, when I get the next slide up, I want you to take a look at all of the statements on the screen, and if there's any that jump out to you that you recognise as being related to autism, if you could just either turn your microphones back on and shout up, or type in the chat, and Julie or Rachel will let me know your responses. Any that are jumping out?
Just a quick question. Sorry to interrupt you, Alison. Is anybody else having problems with the chat? It's telling me that I can't send any messages in it.
Yeah, it's telling me the same. I was just trying to fix it from my end, but I can't seem to find the setting to change it.
Okay, if you find, is anybody else having that problem too? Pop your mics on and tell us.
Yes, I'm having that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a general problem. So if we do hand up or shout out at times like this when Alison's asked you for a question, Rachel, if you managed to resolve it, would you let us all know in the chat?
I don't know whether we can, because we haven't set up the meeting. I'm wondering whether it's an administrator that can do it.
I will inquire about that, but in the meantime we'll have to do it by voice, I think. Okay.
Makes people shy, doesn't it, when they have to turn their microphones on? No ideas? Any of those that you think may be related to autism?
Hiya, I think stimming's definitely one.
Yeah, thank you. We will talk. I will talk about stimming a little bit when we move on to the next slide. But yeah, definitely stimming is associated with autism.
Sensory overload.
Sensory overload, yeah, again, definitely associated.
I think most of them are.
Yeah, I often get that response, actually. A lot of people say all of them. But I'm going to move on to the next slide. So all the traits or statements that are highlighted in green tend to be some of the traits that you may see associated with autism. These are some of the characteristics you may see in your autistic pupils, but you may only see a few of these, you may see all of them. It obviously varies greatly between individuals, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a bit more depth when we look at the spectrum. But there are a few things I want to pull out of there. So you may have heard that autistic people lack empathy. And this is actually a myth, and it's research around that has recently been debunked completely. And a lot of autistic adults actually talk about experiencing hyperempathy, and that so this is, you know, they experience too much empathy. They kind of describe a feeling of kind of absorbing other people's emotions around them, and this becomes highly dysregulating, very overwhelming for them. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Irregular sleep patterns, you can see there, that one hasn't been highlighted, but actually it is very common for autistic individuals to have sleep disorders as well. And a recent study shows that 50 to 80% of autistic people have sleep disorders as well. So again, that's important to bear in mind when we're working with autistic students. Obviously, lack of sleep is going to impact upon their engagement and all the rest of it in school, their mood as well, of course. What else have we got? So somebody mentioned stimming. So yeah, this is stimming, for those of you that don't know, is those kind of little repetitive actions, movements or verbalisations that you may see or hear. And it is essentially a human response to the environment. So we all stim. You know, some examples, you might know someone who jiggles their leg when they're sitting down. You might know someone, I twiddle my hair. All of these kind of things are stims, but autistic people do more of them, and they need to do more of them to regulate themselves emotionally and on a sensory level. What else did I want to pick out? So likes IT, Minecraft mad. Obviously that's a very sort of stereotypical trait, but I guess it's linked into the fact that many autistic people will have kind of special interests that they become very hyper focused on, and that they sort of, you know, become experts on that particular topic. Is there anything else, Rachel or Julie, that you'd like to bring up?
In terms of the general dislike of change as well, Alison, that's highlighted here, no one mentioned that as one of something that they'd noted, but that is something that we do see, and it's reported to us a lot from staff in nurseries and schools during those periods of transition, and that anxiety around changes, and when that unpredictable aspect of the routine, that desire to keep things the same changes, sometimes we can see that impact through children's anxiety and then their behaviour.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and one last thing, avoids eye contact. So it's very common that autistic individuals will struggle with eye contact. They'll find that quite painful or uncomfortable, and actually struggle to process what you're saying to them whilst trying to maintain that eye contact. But it's not always the case. So some autistic individuals won't have so much difficulty with eye contact. So yeah, just to make a point of that as well. So you may hear autism referred to as ASD, autism spectrum disorder, ASC, autism spectrum condition, Asperger's. This did used to have its own separate diagnostic criteria. However, it's no longer a separate diagnosis. Pervasive developmental disorder, high functioning autism, and we will talk in a moment about functioning labels as well. PDA, and this stands for pathological demand avoidance. This is a kind of profile of autism. So somebody can only have the profile of a pathological demand avoidance if they have a diagnosis of autism. They already need that diagnosis to be termed pathological demand avoidant. And you may hear it termed as neurological diversity or neurodivergent. Any questions at this point before I move on? Okay. So let's look at the autism spectrum then. And in front of you, you can see there you've got the visible light spectrum. And as you can see, the various parts of that spectrum are noticeably different from each other. Blue looks very different from red, but they're both on that visible light spectrum. Red is not more blue than blue is, and red is not more spectrum than blue is. So just because it's further up the spectrum doesn't mean that it's more so than blue, which is on that lower end of the spectrum. So when people discuss colours, they don't talk about how far along the spectrum a colour is. They don't say, you know, oh, I'm wearing colours today that are on the low end of the spectrum. But when people talk about autism, they tend to talk as if it were a gradient and not a spectrum at all. So people think you can be a little autistic or extremely autistic, the way that a paint colour could be a little red or extremely red. But autism isn't that simple. It isn't a set of defined symptoms that collectively worsen as you move up the spectrum. And actually, autistic people with what is often deemed as high functioning autism actually often resent that term. They don't feel it's helpful, and they actually don't feel that, you know, a lot of the time that they don't function well and they struggle with day-to-day activities. And then those with so-called severe autism also find it unhelpful. It can limit their opportunities when we use that label, and also many will not struggle so much with some tasks on some days, for example, and often have key areas of strength. So, for example, although they may be non-speaking, they may actually understand many social conventions and have less kind of executive functioning, planning, organising skills than a very articulate autistic person. So functioning labels can be quite unhelpful. And also because a person's functioning levels can change a lot throughout their lifetime. So, you know, as a child, they may be deemed low functioning, but then actually as they mature and become adults, you know, they may then be considered high functioning. And, you know, also it's going to depend very much upon how stressful things are in their life at that time. So yeah, they're not fixed sort of functioning levels. And how I tend to talk about it instead is to refer to high or low support needs. So does an individual at the moment, have they got high support needs or have they got low support needs at the moment? So how does the autism spectrum actually look? Well, it's a rainbow of traits that look different for every individual. And all autistic people are affected in one way or another in most or all of these boxes. If you only check one or two of these descriptions in front of you, then they don't call it autism, they'll call it something else. So as an example, if you only struggle with if you only struggle with sensory processing, then that would be deemed sensory processing disorder. So in order for a person to be considered autistic, they must have differences in multiple categories spanning that spectrum. Each person's dominant colour palette may look very different and may change regularly over time. And you may hear that, you know, this being referred to as a sort of spiky profile. So they may have skills in some areas and have challenges in others, and that may change throughout their life. Is that okay? Is there any questions before I move on? Okay, so looking at the triad of differences then. And these are the three areas of difference which are required for diagnosis. So we've got social interaction and communication, the communication skills we use when engaging with others, flexibility, the ability to think about something in a different or an imaginative way. And sensory issues, the process of receiving and responding to sensory input. As you can see, all of those areas overlap, and that's because they will all have an impact upon one another. So, for example, if we're thinking about an individual's social interaction and communication differences, then that is going to be affected by their sensory integration needs and their flexibility or inflexibility of thought, and vice versa. Okay, so now we're going to look in a little depth at social interaction and communication then. So I've just put some examples on the screen of some challenges that autistic people may experience within this area. So thinking about facial expression, this involves both reading other people's facial expressions and kind of using and expressing themselves with the same facial expressions as other people do. Tone of voice, so it may be the case some autistic people may have kind of unusual intonation to their voice. They may have exaggerated accents or have kind of monotone intonation to their voice. I've worked with quite a lot of children that have had an American accent. They're not American, but yeah, they've spoken with an American accent. Common gestures, so you know, it's using those gestures that have shared meanings. So waving, pointing, these are things that autistic children can struggle with. And actually, I've worked with a lot of children who will wave with their palm facing themselves, and that's because that's what they see when other people are waving at them. So they're mimicking that in exactly the way that they would perceive and see that. Autistic children will tend to use instrumental gestures, so using communication partners as tools, taking your hand to the door handle to request that you open the door, for example, or taking your hand to something that they would like. Eye contact, I've talked about that already, but yeah, just to emphasise that in order to give eye contact, a lot of autistic children, that will take up a lot of their processing. So they then won't be able to attend to the instruction or, you know, whatever sort of verbal message you're intending to give them. So actually, if we allow them to look away as we're talking, that will help them to then process that message. Body language, again, similar to facial expression, they may use different body language, and they may have difficulties understanding and interpreting other people's body language. Echolalia, does anybody know what echolalia is?
Echoing back what you've said to them, they should play and also back the play.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, it's when they repeat something that they've heard. So that may be immediate. So immediate echolalia is when they repeat directly after you, something that you've said. And then there's delayed echolalia as well, which is when they may repeat certain phrases or things that they've heard, you know, maybe from TV or the radio, and they may say those things out of context. A lot of the time, echolalia does have a communicative intent, but we'll talk more about that in the session next week, if any of you plan to come along to that. Forming relationships and making friends. This can be a real difficulty for autistic people. Expressive and or receptive language delays. So yeah, they can have difficulties forming communication, and also understanding other people's communication. And this can be delayed, or it can be a sort of co-occurring condition. Auditory processing, so this involves filtering out sounds in the environment, the ability to be able to do that, so they may find that really difficult, but it also involves processing what you're saying to them, so they may have difficulties in that area. Literal communication style, so you know, having difficulties reading between the lines, and things like that, you know, understanding metaphors. And a preference for solitary play over playing with their peers. So what can we do to support within this area? And the main thing we need to be doing and thinking about is that relationship building, and I'm sure you're all very much aware of this, and you know, have this fully embedded into your practice. So it's being actively and consciously aware of becoming that individual's companion and their friend, learning from them, you know, to marvel at the drop of water that's dripping from the gutter and onto the playground, sharing with them in a moment of wonder and satisfaction at a perfectly organised line of toys, appreciating fun and play in the way that that individual does. So you genuinely enjoy spending time with them. You let them know that their company is so enjoyable that it is worthy to be given some of your time. You may, you know, they need a little movement break from the classroom. Maybe they've been sitting for a long period of time. You run with them outside and you might say, oh, I needed that. I needed to move then. So that you're giving them those relatable experiences. Engage in their passions or their special interests. Stim with them, so you know, imitate and copy and join them in those repetitive movements and verbalizations, and accept that whatever they do, you can find delight in doing it too. Engaging in something for enjoyment with no expectations or prescriptions. And this is the basis of all the teaching and learning that will go on to take place. So this is your foundation.
And that's really key, isn't it, Alison, that, you know, particularly looking at engaging their passions, knowing children's interests and their motivators, what makes them tick as an individual. Certainly, if we want to create those win-win situations with children so that, you know, we can get a little bit of what we want from them, but also they can feel really engaged and motivated by what we're doing with them, we've got to really understand how they think and sort of enter into their world. They may not be able to find a way into ours.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've built that trusting relationship with them, they, as a result, you know, as a byproduct of that, they are more likely to engage in the things that you want them to. Yeah. So now I just want to talk to you a little bit about something called the double empathy problem. And in the little visual that you can see on the screen, on the left-hand side, you've got an autistic person. So they may struggle to read between the lines, overcome other people's misconceptions about autism, and to manage their sensory distractions. If we then look over on the right-hand side at the non-autistic person, they may struggle to form positive first impressions of the autistic person, recognise and understand autism, and imagine an autistic sensory differences and difficulties. So actually both parties may struggle to understand each other's thoughts, feelings, behaviour and differences. Communication is obviously a two-way process. As well as obviously supporting children to develop their communication in whatever way works best for them, and we'll look at lots of ways to do this next week, we also need to change how we communicate with them. And we also need to learn their body language and their non-verbal communications. So this theory, this double empathy problem theory, was developed by someone called Damien Milton in 2012. And it does help to describe what happens when autistic and non-autistic people struggle to understand each other.
I think there's been some good research, hasn't there, Alison, about this over recent years, and looking at how autistic adults understand each other, and how actually there is a very good understanding from the same mindset, if you see what I mean. And I work with so many members of staff and parents who will tell me, I don't know what they're trying to tell me. I don't know what my child is trying to tell me. I don't know what this young person, why this young person is behaving in the way they do. And that's our difficulty, isn't it? In reading their minds in a way. It's our difficulty in understanding where they're coming from, just as much as it is a young person's difficulty in understanding what's going on in the world around them. I think it's an emerging area of research as well, isn't it, with lots of support for this.
Absolutely, and I think it really helps to kind of to promote that empathy for our autistic students, you know, and to consider the role that, you know, that we play in that communication breakdown with our autistic students. So yeah, I think it's a really helpful theory. Okay, so moving on then to look at flexibility. So again, just putting on the screen some difficulties that your autistic students may experience, and Rachel talked about this earlier when we looked at the triad. So changes to everyday routines can cause heightened anxiety. Points of transition can cause confusion, anxiety, distress, which then results in, you know, some behaviours that we find difficult to manage. They tend to focus on details and have a single channeled attention. So this is actually called monotropic mindset, and it does explain some of the difficulties in then kind of transitioning from one task to another, but we'll look at that in a little moment in more detail. They may experience difficulties in generalisation or transferring skills across settings. So as an example, you know, you may hear parents describe certain skills that the child has at home, but you're not seeing them in school. And, you know, sometimes the tendency in that situation is to think, you know, that maybe the parent is exaggerating what this child can do or their skills, whereas in actual fact, it is most likely due to the fact that that child hasn't been able to generalise or transfer that particular skill that they're using at home into the school environment, and equally vice versa. You know, when children pick up a new skill in school, it doesn't always automatically mean that child will be able to generalise that skill into a different context, so using it back at home without some kind of support to do that. Special interests fall into this category, and these are you know, a wonderful tool for us as educators, because they're our way in. You know, we can kind of utilise a child's special interests to engage them in all sorts of curriculum activities, and also to, you know, like I say, to build those relationships as well. So never underestimate the importance of a special interest to an autistic child. Need for predictability. That falls into, you know, difficulties in the changes to routines and transition. Imaginative play. So yeah, you may notice that your autistic students play differently, and we will look at that in more detail in a moment as well. And difficulty in predicting what will happen next. You may also notice that some of your autistic students tend to be quite rule bound, or have difficulties with others not following rules. Maybe they like to always be first in the line, and have anxiety around not being first in the line. They may struggle when things don't go to plan or as expected. Things are not perfect. They may find that they may have a lot of difficulties around that, and find that they experience a lot of anxiety over that as well. Okay, so this little comic strip here in front of you was designed by an autistic adult to describe why it's hard for them to switch tasks, and they call it tendril theory. It says, when I'm focused on something, my mind sends out a million tendrils of thought. This expands into all of the thoughts and feelings. When I need to switch tasks, I must retract all of the tendrils of my mind. This takes some time. Eventually, I can shift to the new task, but when I am interrupted or must switch abruptly, it feels like all of the tendrils are being ripped out. That's why I don't react well. Please just give me time to switch tasks when I'm ready. And I love that. I think that, is a lovely little image and representation of what they are experiencing. What considerations can we put in place bearing this in mind? So building in opportunity and time for young people to reach a natural ending with tasks wherever possible. Not always easy in mainstream, but wherever possible. Use sand timers and countdowns to provide time for young people to draw tasks to a close. You may use visual or verbal cues to signify when tasks need to come to a close. So again, putting that preparation in place so that they can start to retract some of those tendrils in preparation. And also using sensory cues. So maybe having a piece of music, a song or a sound to signify endings of activities. Again, so that they're given that a little more time to start retracting those tendrils themselves. Any questions?
That's a really lovely analogy. I've not seen that before, Alison. It's such a good way of thinking about it, and it reminds us how important that giving of take-up time really is. And I believe it's something like 10 seconds should be the take-up time when we ask children to do something or if we're directing them. Now, 10 seconds where we're in front of a child can feel like torture, sort of standing there in silence, but actually, the second we're then trying to scaffold and structure for them, maybe rephrasing or repeating, for that child it can be, I've got to go back and start processing that information again. Those tendrils, I'm trying to repurpose them, and that can be really quite stressful. Yeah. So sort of it is so important to give the take-up time.
Absolutely, and it's going back to what I mentioned previously about that monotropic mindset. So all of the tendrils go into everything, so they have that very single channeled attention, and they will hyper focus on that one thing that they're doing. So as that image describes, it's then they have so many more tendrils to then pull back.
And it's a great way to explain some of those moments that we have in schools when we've had a really fantastic session. Maybe we've been at the workstation, the child has really done some fabulous pieces of work, and we think, oh, they've done great, let's push them a little bit further. I've said we're only going to do 2, but we might just get a third question in here. We might get a third work basket out. But previously we've said we're only going to do the 2. Looking at that when I'm interrupted, when I've got to switch abruptly, when those expectations change, that predictability change, and you're expecting something different, we can see why that would be really stressful.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so moving on now, I've got this little mind map here, and I just want you guys to kind of shout out any, or unless the chat is fixed, I don't know.
It's fixed.
Oh, it's fixed.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have to be brave and turn your microphones on then. You can just type in the chat if you want. Any words or things that come to mind when you think of play. That would be fantastic. And I will fill your answers in on this little mind map here.
We've got imagination. Is anyone else feeling brave? Which feeds nicely into some role play, some simple symbolic play. Enjoyment, most certainly. That's a really, really important aspect of play, isn't it? It makes us want to do it again. It being fun, developing communication, speech, language and communication skills. How about this is one for me, learning.
Learning. Yeah.
Exploration.
Lovely.
Toys. Any more out there? Relationships. Friendships. Any more? I think that might be it, Alison. We've got quite a lot of nice ones there.
That's absolutely wonderful.
Oh,
Yeah.
and for Julie, practicing, honing those skills and confidence. Oh, you're playing second wind.
Oh, I hope you don't mind those latecomers if I don't go back and type those in. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions. Got some really lovely words and ideas there that we associate with play. So what I want to draw your attention to now is a lot of us, we tend to, when we think of play, we do think of friendships and interaction and playing together, and you know, particularly, you know, when we're thinking of young children, that's got a real emphasis, hasn't it? Being with other children, playing with other children. This is the dictionary definition of play. So if you have a look here, oh, sorry, it would help if I kept it on. To engage in activity for enjoyment and recreation rather than a serious or practical purpose. And then the synonyms, we've got amuse oneself, entertain oneself, enjoy oneself, have fun. So for something to be true play, it must be internally motivated, immersive, restorative, joyful, and freely chosen. So you may have heard or you may use the term functional play. So that is playing with a toy in the way its designer intended. Autistic children may be more interested in how that toy functions. All play is functional to the person who engages in it. Autistic play may look different, but it is just as important and just as valid. So now I'm going to look at some forms of autistic play with you. So this is an inexhaustive list of a few forms of play autistic children may engage in, some of which are not usually associated with play, but which fit that true definition of play. Obviously, there's using playful resources and activities within a learning context, and that is obviously a very important and integral part of our curriculum and our day in school. However, for it to be true play, it's all of those things which I've just mentioned: immersive, freely chosen, joyful. So structural play. This is lining up toys, stacking them, or sorting them by certain criteria. And this may be done in order to hone their counting or organising skills, to create patterns that often go unnoticed by others, or as a form of art. Analytical play. So figuring out how things work, for example, by repeatedly watching a wheel spin to study the mechanics, taking toys apart and then putting it all back together again, working out, really working out the mechanics of that particular item. Experimental play. This is conducting experiments to study the relationship between things, such as dropping different objects to the ground from different heights to study the differences in their impact. Obviously, this is a bit easier to manage if the child is stood in one place, dropping them from a chair. If they're throwing them across the room, it's a wholly different matter. But that's we may need to direct that play in another form. Autodidactic play. So this is teaching themselves new skills or researching matters of interest to them. Sensory play. These are enjoying activities that stimulate their sense of touch, smell, taste, sight, and or hearing, as well as those involving movement and balance as well. Parallel play. So enjoying the company of others while doing their own thing. This way, they can engage in that analytical or experimental play without disruption. So they're, again, thinking back to the tendril theory, they're getting very immersed within their own form of play. So therefore, other children coming in, that would then be perceived as a disruption to them, ripping those tendrils out of their mind. Actually, many autistic adults describe that they still prefer parallel play. So, they'll have their friends over to spend time with, but actually they'll sit in a room and be doing different things together whilst they're spending time together. Electronic devices, so learning, researching, connecting and playing on electronic devices. Many parents of autistic children have limited their children's time on these devices, which has led to distress, frustration and anxiety. Parents who removed screen time limits for their autistic children reported that their children thrived and became more balanced, and that children with speech delays actually rapidly improved their verbal skills. Observation. So this is intensely observing things of interest to them, often things which appear mundane to others. And observation helps them to understand and relate to their environment. And finally, reflection. And this is, thinking about all kinds of things. It may look like the child is daydreaming or staring into space blankly. They're most definitely not. The autistic mind is always busy. Any questions at this point? No. Okay, so looking at sensory then. And on the screen here, on the left-hand side, there are some examples of sensory avoiding behaviours that you may see in some of the children that you work with. And on the right-hand side, there are some examples of sensory seeking behaviours that you might see. So sensory processing differences can cause many challenges for autistic individuals. Our youngest pupils will not have awareness themselves of how much difficulty they are experiencing compared to other people. It's important to be aware that they're not simply overreacting or underreacting to the same experiences that we as neurotypical people experience. They actually process sensory experiences differently, either in a very heightened way, which you may hear referred to as hypersensitive, and that can be distressing or in the least distracting, and they will therefore engage in behaviours to reduce that overwhelm. Those examples there on the left are just some of them. Or they may experience sensory stimuli and input in muted ways and seek much more input just to regulate themselves, just to get themselves to where they should be. So sensory processing differences can also bring the individual a lot of joy, as they can experience the world in so much more depth. You know, even the most simple things, you know, when I talked about enjoying watching a drip of water fall from the gutter onto the playground, you know, that sensory experience for them, they may be seeing lots of light colours being reflected in that drop of water. So, you know, they can experience the world in much more depth and get a lot of joy from that. So it's not all bad. And each individual will have their own unique sensory profile and will often experience a mix of both sensory seeking and sensory aversions. So, you know, they're not one or the other. They're most often a complex mix of the two of these experiences. So we need to carefully observe and get to know the child to fully understand their profile, and, you know, and then in turn to provide the most suitable experiences and environment sort of accommodations to support them. So we've got a little video here, and this is a simulation of sensory overload. So we'll watch this and then we can have a chat about it afterwards. Can you hear that okay?
Yeah, it's coming through, Alison. Thank you.
Great.
Six, 7, 8, 9. Take my hand. No, Alex. No, it's fine, isn't it? I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
Okay, so that's quite powerful, isn't it? I know, Rachel, you like that video, don't you?
Yeah, that's a really, we were talking about it briefly before we started. It's such a good one, because I think it'd be very difficult to see how emotional that can make you feel, and to feel that anxiety with all those blurring images, the sounds, and really helps us to put ourselves into the children's shoes, really, of what they may be experiencing and how frightening that would feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really demonstrates that kind of inability to filter out all of that sensory input. It makes me anxious just watching it. So you may have noticed as well that he was, when he was sort of counting on his fingers, that he was stimming then in an attempt to sort of regulate himself and bring himself back. But yeah, obviously didn't help him much in that moment. But yeah, I think it's really useful to reflect on that and kind of realise and have empathy for how much harder our autistic students are working every day just to navigate the environment.
And also seeing the reactions of the passers-by there, and how, if you put yourselves in the perspective, we all work really closely with parents, and how that must feel from their perspective as well. It's it can be really, really difficult.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we've got a little sensory task for you, and we want you to think about if there could be a sensory cause to any of these behaviours on the next slide. So let's have a look. Example 1. A pupil always runs out of his PE lesson, especially during ball games. If you could just type in the chat or speak up whether you think there could be a sensory cause to this behaviour.
Noises being picked up by a few people, that those sounds of the balls bouncing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Especially in those echoey gyms.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah, big echoey halls, multiple bouncing balls. Quite often, you know, the children are kind of squealing or laughing, or you know, you've got the sound of their shoes running on the hard surface as well.
We're picking up the busyness and the other children around them and the movement around as well with those.
That's a really good point. Yeah, all of the movement as well. Absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, next example. A pupil frequently covers his ears and goes under the desk.
Noise being picked up here. Yeah, classroom noise, that maybe that inability to filter out some of those background sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the real clue is covering his ears, isn't it? And then going under the desk as well. So obviously trying to avoid that sensation or the noise. And yeah, really good point that, you know, it's often multiple noises, isn't it, within a classroom. You know, you've got the scraping chairs, different conversations going on, different chatter. Absolutely, well done. So example 3, a pupil always pushes others when moving from one classroom to another.
Needing space, somebody's put there, feeling overcrowded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Too close in their space. I think that idea of awareness of that sort of body and space is really important here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Unaware of physical space.
Yeah. And also, you know, if we think about those children who are sensitive to touch in particular, it tends to be light touch that they find aversive. So in the corridor, you might have multiple people brushing past, you know, their shoulders brushing past yours. So that pupil may be, you know, it may be an attempt to avoid that painful sensation. Some really good answers there. Example 4, a pupil appears distressed when the bell goes for dinner time.
Noise being picked up again here.
Yeah.
Yeah, transition. Very good point there. Noise, movement, noises, smells.
Yeah, really good. Yeah. Yeah, you guys are great. So yeah, there's the noise of the bell, isn't there? I know because I'm not used to hearing school bells at Broadmeadow, we don't have any loud bells to signify dinner time or anything like that. So when I go into mainstream schools now, it makes me jump out my skin when I hear the bells going. Some of them are really quite loud and intrusive. Others are a bit more discreet, but yeah, it could absolutely be the bell itself, couldn't it? I love the fact that someone's also mentioned it's a transition time, which could be really difficult. Also, we had the smells from the dinner hall. That's tends to be a really strong smell, doesn't it? And then you've kind of got the social expectations of the dinner hall, haven't you, as well? So they could be anticipating.
Lots of people are now picking up about recognising what the bell represents and that lack of that unstructured time, that different routine, perhaps someone's just put in different members of staff, all coming back to that change.
Yeah, fantastic. I like that you're thinking beyond sensory as well. That's perfect. Example 5, a pupil becomes aggressive when playing with peers on the playground.
Right, we've got some answers just coming in now. So becoming overexcited, overstimulated, perhaps even being unaware of their own strength. Again, coming back to that, unaware of their self in space. Lack of understanding of how forceful they're being.
Yeah.
That sort of being very heavy-handed, always wanting to win, trying to control the play.
Yeah.
Being unaware of their own strength, not wanting to share.
Yeah. So it's those social expectations and conventions, it's difficulties around that. We're getting a lot of answers related to that, which is, yeah, a really, really good point.
And then others coming too close into their personal space.
Yeah, yeah, similar to what we were saying about in the corridors, absolutely. And then as well, there's the multiple noise. There's all of that triad of differences. You know, may have a real impact at this time of day in particular, mightn't they? So yeah, thanks for your answers, brilliant. So let's move on then to look at the stress bucket. So these are, you know, a series. It's not always that if we see children, you know, unfortunately reach the point of meltdown when they're unable to control their actions or behaviour anymore, it may not always be that there has been one trigger leading to that distress or outburst. It may be that actually there has been a series of smaller triggers throughout the day. So that's the concept of this stress bucket. So throughout the day, you've got changes in routine, unsure what is going to happen next, difficulties with communication, literal interpretation of situation, sensory differences. As you can see, the bucket is filling and filling and filling. Anxious about failure, does not know or understand the roles, poor concept of time, and eventually that stress bucket is going to completely overflow, isn't it? And these are just some examples of the challenges that an individual may face throughout the day, or throughout a half an hour period, you know, even. So, you know, it's important to be aware of that it can be a series of minor triggers. And again, you know, bringing you back to thinking about how much harder your autistic students are working just to navigate the social expectations, the environment, before they've even begun to sit down and start learning. So some key pedagogical approaches before we finish up then. So relationship building and empathy, number one, that's your foundation. Know the pupil as an individual, understand and recognise their unique set of strengths and challenges. View behaviour as a communication of unmet need, always being curious. I wonder why he did that. I wonder what could have caused that. I wonder what we can do to support with that. Structure, routine and consistency. Prepare for changes and think ahead. Use special interests within activities wherever possible. It may take a degree of creativity. Always presume competence. So if you do have learners, for example, who are non-speaking, don't presume that they don't understand everything that you're saying, and that they're fully thinking, feeling little people who are absolutely absorbing and taking everything in. Acknowledge all communication, including no. You know, it's really important that that we are encouraging our autistic students to self-advocate, that we do acknowledge those attempts to communicate, and that we do listen when they're telling us that no, actually, I'm not ready to do that right now. And sorry, before I move on, Rachel, Julie, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just want to say, acknowledge that for us as the adults in these scenarios, when it comes to that acknowledging or communication there, that we need to modify our communication. That's really, really key. And where you've said that, you know, acknowledging them saying no, sometimes we recognise that that word from us as adults can be a red flag as it is, you know, and we need to think of how we are communicating. That is so important. And whether that is reducing our language, visual cues, physical prompts, whatever it may be, you know, how are we bringing together that total communication approach for children, because that's really going to help them to respond and engage.
Absolutely, so important.
I think that's right, and I think that brings in the emotional side of things as well, doesn't it? Because when young people know that, when young people are, you know, when the adults around them are adjusting to meet their needs, that builds their self-esteem, doesn't it, as a person who's worthwhile and an important member of the community as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Oops. So finally, just a note on working in partnership with parents. So remembering that parents are experts on your student, use their knowledge and insight as much as possible. Ask them questions and explain why you're asking those questions, because, you know, it's important for the parents to feel valued as, you know, as someone who's working together with you. Be conscious of the power behind your words and language. So focus on support needs and just be aware of, you know, that you're not using too much negativity around what, you know, what they can't do or their behaviour and the rest of it. Try if you can to focus on that child's support needs. So, oh, today they needed a bit more support with X, Y, Z. Do share positives and progress, however small it is. Parents love to hear even those really small steps of progress. Be mindful of how isolated they may feel, you know, particularly as their child is in a mainstream setting. You know, they may be experiencing parenting and all the rest of it very differently. So yeah, just be mindful of how isolated they may be feeling. Try to discuss any issues with them collaboratively. Obviously, you know, you're going to have parents that are, you know, a bit more easy to engage with, but, you know, as long as from our side we're endeavouring to do that all the time. And appreciate, of course, that this may be a very stressful time for them, you know, starting a new school. And that is the end of the session. Sorry, I've run over a little, but yeah, our email addresses are on the screen. So if you did have any questions or concerns, please do get in touch.
Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask right now? I'm going to turn the recording off so that we don't record that bit, but there we go.